All right, cool. We're live. Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. We're kind of talking just now a little bit about my background. I came recently to the John Vervaeke community, and I'd spent a lot of time in the worlds of Ken Wilber, and I had studied philosophy in undergrad through what was a great books program where we read original texts, and they were all discussion method classes that kind of aimed for a dialogos type of structure. So it's through the conversation between the professor and the other students that you would kind of come to together. You would come to know like at the point of the author, which was a great experience. It was a great program. So I had kind of gotten into Vervaeke because he's a great synthesizer. He drew together a lot of threads that between science, religion, the whole aspect of cognitive science that he brings in. I barely knew anything. I didn't really know that the existence of that field before I heard it from him. And I think that seems like very fruitful territory as well. But like I was saying before we started, that you struck me as an interesting person to talk to when I heard your video with Vervaeke, because it seemed like you were earlier in the path of trying to integrate these practices along with the intellectual side of things. And Vervaeke had a lot of interesting things to say, being 30 years deep at that point. And I wanted to chat with you because I think that you're closer to where I am in this path, but I am still at the earliest stages of really kind of actually enacting a lot of the practices and thought processes that John and a lot of the others in that community, like Guy Sangstock, Christopher Mastro Pietra, I think is really interesting too. So a lot of what they're just everything that's kind of part of that integration, I think I'm looking to enact more. So I thought that we might have some common ground in that. And I was interested if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of where you're at and how things are landing for you at the moment right now.
Yeah, so I came to John through spirituality, really. I had a bit of a crisis, like personal crisis, a few years back, probably about 6 years ago now, where I was working for a big accounting firm because I'm an accountant by qualification, and just fell into quite a deep depression and existential angst, and found it difficult to sleep and go to work and do what I needed to do. And it was kind of questioning where I wanted to go in life, like what I wanted my life to be about. Because up until that point, I think I'd kind of just taken meaning from the people around me and done what I thought I was supposed to do to be, I don't know, to be a useful person or someone that's considered to be doing well in life. And so, yeah, it wasn't until I really got to a point of overwhelm at work and kind of like I was drowning in projects and trying to keep up. And I was like, why am I doing this? What is it all for? And do I actually want to get to the top of this mountain that I'm currently climbing? Because it seems like a lot of work, and it seems like I'm killing myself trying to get there. And I don't even know if I want to get there. So then I started sitting back and reflecting on a lot of things, went to see a psychologist, started talking out some of the things that I was feeling and experiencing. And that kind of led me to a wider spiritual search. And I started reading books and devouring whatever I could on spirituality, and then found a local community here in Perth, Western Australia, and started practicing spiritual practices and really introspecting and learning a bit about myself and who I was. And I eventually started getting interested in not only sense-making my life, but sense-making the world and culture at large. That seemed like an interesting thing to me. And I remember when Jordan Peterson came on the scene, I was really interested in the points he was making, particularly around Bill C-16 , 16 in Canada. And, um, and, 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 requiring by law certain speech. I remember being fascinated by that point, and I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense. And then Canada just ended up passing that bill anyway, even after Peterson's testimony in the Senate and all that kind of stuff. He laid out his argument very clearly, and Canada was like, huh, interesting. We're going to do this anyway. And so I found that amazing. And then followed Jordan Peterson really closely for a long time. And then through Peterson came across Vervaeke's work, because there was a couple of YouTube videos out there with Vervaeke and Peterson talking about the meaning of life and you know, really, really deep topics. And yeah, similar to you, the way you described your experience with awakening from the meaning crisis, to me, it was just like, oh, like, yeah, I love the way John was laying out the history of philosophy and Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and then where we've gone as a, you know, Western culture from there. Also tying in Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, you know, mystical experiences, higher states of consciousness, all that kind of stuff, to then outlining, well, we're experiencing currently as a culture, like really, really high rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality, all of that stuff. What is going on here? And how do we address this? Like at a deep level, something is fundamentally wrong or missing, or so
for me, that was a big aspect of what jumped out, as he set it up as there is a serious crisis that needs to be solved, and that's why this is important. Because with my own study of philosophy, you know, typically it's more of a joke when somebody asks what you study. You're like, oh, philosophy. Like, oh, so you know, whatever, and you're not doing it right. You're like, well, not officially or whatever, you know. So most people, you know, really dismiss that as just, it's just not relevant. It's just like idle mind games that have no application to reality and don't deliver anything. But I've always thought that the power of an idea to influence the unfolding of the material world is pretty obvious. I think it's more obvious the more that I've studied it. And so when John combined that with a pressing issue, and one that I felt, I mean, I definitely connected with your experience of the of working in the accounting job and being unable to sleep and just feeling like it was a purposeless sort of existence. I can relate to that in my own recent past, within the last 5 or 6 years as well. And that I definitely relate to that as being a time I am grateful for, though, because it pushed me into caring again about trying to figure these things out. And so I had sensed that problem, and I had felt like also my personal problem really intersected with that. I was having a hard time to feel like I was in a world, or when John uses the word in an atmosphere that made everything cohesive, and it was causing a lot of angst. So when John just presented the story of philosophy, religion, science, and everything else as being all part of this answer to this fundamental question, and we're not answering it very well right now, I really latched onto that. And I think that's what drew me into it as well. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Yeah. Did you, what drew you to it particularly once you started engaging with the work? Like, what is it that kept you going and made you feel like it had promise for you?
It's interesting, because I'm still trying to answer that question for myself. I guess the short answer is I'm not sure, but there's something intriguing about it. So for me, you know, I'm on a particular spiritual path with Buddhism that has enlightenment as the end goal. So I'm trying to raise my consciousness to a point where enlightenment's a possibility. And serving heart in that. So walking a path of heart where there's openness and care and I, thou, and relationships that matter deeply. And that question of enlightenment is a really, really difficult subject to get a good grasp on. It like seems always just out of reach. Like there's this substance there, but it's hard to describe or really tangibly get a hold of. And spiritual teachers have really clear understandings and teachings about enlightenment and about what existence is and what consciousness is, because they're talking from their experience, right? They're directly experiencing consciousness and then relaying that to people that are still ego-based. So someone, a spiritual teacher might say, everything is one, we are all one, and you're just not experiencing that because you're not, you're still experiencing yourself as a solid self, and you need to do these practices to kind of advance and progress. And I find that intriguing, and I have little tastes of that, but that's not my ongoing experience. So, and the thing that I find intriguing about John and Guy and like Jordan Hall, the conversations that Jordan and John were having around religion that is not a religion, things like that, is that it seems like this conversation is alive and emerging in real time. So these people are all interested in the same subject, and they're trying to figure it out as they go. And when I hear that, I'm like, wow, okay, I'm interested in this, because this isn't someone telling me what the answer is. This is a group of people figuring out the answer through dialogos, through circling, through whatever it is, trying to attune to the logos and then speak it in as high fidelity as they can. And to me, that's just a really interesting journey to go on. So I guess similar to you, that inspired me to start to be part of these conversations and try to participate in them, because that's more interesting than just watching on YouTube. So yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what it is that draws me to it, but it's like something in it is like, man, I can't turn away from this, because it's like it grips me.
Yeah, it's really a contrast to, as much as I did really appreciate the education I got at where I went to school, where I studied the great books. It was a tremendous education. But just by its nature, when you have a program that is based on the great books, it's going to tend to be that teaching from a set rubric. Like, this has been decided, and these are the answers. And so if you internalize them, it will improve your life. And that's true. I think it definitely does improve your life to internalize the conversation, as they called it, that has happened up to that point. But like you, when I saw people struggling in real time with it in their own minds, and never trampling over quite the same landscape each time, to me, I thought it had such an electric feel that I thought it was missing in the more formal study of it that I received in school. Even though that was the perfect foundation, and even though the classes would sometimes take on that character, there was always a settledness to it. Like, these are the greats, and this is the story. And I think it's the conversation is a lot of times like messy too, but in a good way. And I find that kind of appealing too, that sometimes there are blind alleys or strange tangents that come up, and sometimes it all works together, sometimes it doesn't, but there's just so much amazing stuff that's being just sparking off it. That, to me, I think that that and the idea of that act itself being a spiritual practice, I find really fascinating. How does that, when you see those two things being put together, like how does that land for your spiritual practice of the art of conversation is too light a word, but that dialogos, that dialogue, like making that a spiritual practice, that was a novel thing for me to see those two presented together. So what did that, how did you connect with that aspect of it? How did that land for you?
Yeah, I would say that can be true. It depends on how you approach it. You can approach a dialectic in a way where you're not really interested in self-transformation or changing your propositions. So John's distinction between Philia Nikeia and Philia Sophia, so the love of victory or the love of wisdom. It's like people can come to a dialectic with kind of a debate mindset where they're trying to win and prove themselves right. But yeah, I think it can be a spiritual practice if one approaches dialectic in an attempt to enter dialogos and not present their own propositions as truth, but listen to something other than themselves. So there's a third entity that emerges as we have a conversation, that is the conversation. And the more you and I tune into that and listen to that and try and speak that, the closer we're getting to being in tune with the logos and in tune with something other than things that we already know and bring to the conversation that are concrete and solid. So yeah, I think there's that possibility. And the way John presents the 4 P's of knowing, propositional knowing, procedural knowing, perspectival knowing, and participatory knowing. John kind of avoids putting value differentials on those 4 levels. Like they're all equally valid. But for me, like, it seems to be that I value participatory knowing much more than propositional knowing. Like propositional knowing is useful and like necessary, but the participation in a conversation like this and the active self-transformation, like if I open myself fully to you and this conversation, there's the possibility for me, the high likelihood for me to walk away from this conversation a different person than who I was when I started it, which is really cool. Like that transformation is possible. And that to me is what spirituality is. Spirituality is self-transformation to discover more inherently what's real and true. And so, Dialogos can totally be a spiritual practice if it's taken in that way, I think. Yeah.
Another thing that struck me about what you were saying about, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about your spiritual community too, that fascinates me. But when you were describing that, what appealed to you in part was the way that enlightened teachers could pass on the knowledge of experience that they had. And that reminded me of something that I came across in Ken Wilber, which he calls spiritual injunction, which he tries to compare certain spiritual practices to a scientific structure, in the sense that it makes a statement about reality and says, and if you want to know that this is true, do this.
Yes.
And then you will see that it is true. And I remember I latched onto that idea immediately, and I was like, that's a great measure right there. It's something that is being shared as an experienceable observation, and you're given instructions on how to do that. What is it? That's also a fairly novel concept for me in like the last couple of years that I've thought about it in that way. Was that something that you had to, like, what was the transition? Well, I don't know like what you thought before you went into the spiritual community, but was there a process of change into like embracing that, or was it hard to shift into that way of thinking, or was it something that came naturally?
So there's a couple of things that come up for me with that question. The first is that my teacher will often say, don't believe what I say, check it out and find out for yourself, because believing what I say is useless. It has to be your own direct experience. So that's really important, in that you can approach spirituality in a scientific way, using the scientific method. Like you can have a hypothesis and then you go about practices that will test that hypothesis, and either you find out that the hypothesis is true or it's not, and then you start again. You create a new hypothesis that might be closer to the truth, and you keep going until you validate it for yourself, right? So I think that's awesome to hold that as really, really important, not just to believe someone, oh, he said the universe is all one. Okay, all right, I'm just going to hold that as my truth now, and then just pretend that I know that directly. It's not, doesn't mean anything.
I know the words.
I know the words. Exactly right. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, I remember a moment where I was really grappling with this internally. It was almost like my old worldview was grappling with this new emerging like possibility sense that I had, because my old worldview was very, very scientific, very, very modernistic, very, very it was I would have described myself as an agnostic, not an atheist, because I couldn't say for sure that God didn't exist, but I was very skeptical, and I would say we can't prove either way whether God exists or not. And my whole thing was, well, science seems to have a grip on reality that's pretty strong. That's just now the worldview that I've adopted, and all the corporate structures that I was involved in and the intellectual think tanks and academia was all in line with that. And there was a moment where I was, imbibing these spiritual teachings, and this kind of new pathway was presenting itself to me. And I was like, the experience was like, I don't know whether I can reconcile the two. Like, I don't know whether I can take on this new possibility that seems to be showing itself and still have like science as a fundamental. And it was like this process that took some time inside of me to integrate and align and allow me to feel comfortable with exploring things that weren't validated and tested through a third-party objective lens. They were much more subjective first-person experiences about fundamental reality. And it was a very different way of thinking about life and the world. So yeah, it took me some time to get through that. It was a difficult sort of period transition.
Yeah. And what are kind of the operating principles of the community you're in? What's it like? What's the shared sense of direction that you have there?
Yeah, so it's a Buddhist community founded on Buddhist precepts. It's kind of a modern take on Buddhism, so it's not as traditional as some, say Mahayana Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism. It's more in line with modern day living and being in the marketplace and having a job. I run a business, I have a wife, we have a house and a dog and all this kind of stuff. Like, there's things that are part of life as well. So the main sort of teachings, I would say, there are kind of 4 teachings that come to mind for me that have been really important for me. They are maturity, so developing maturity, responsibility, making life work, taking care of oneself and one's friends and family, that kind of, so growing up in a way. And I like when John says the child is to the adult as the adult is to the sage, because people get to 18 years of age and they're like, well, I'm an adult now. And it's like, okay, maybe, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily a mature adult. You can still be immature and selfish and irresponsible and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's a necessity to growing up and becoming a let's just say mature adult. So that's one teaching that I found really important. Another teaching that I found really important is self-acceptance. So learning to understand myself deeply and know how my mind works and know how my body works and know what triggers me and activates me and gets me into a defensive kind of survival threat mode. And how my body responds to that somatically and like shuts down and wants to pull away and wants to attack and all this kind of stuff. So it's kind of watching that process, watching my mind in relationships, watching myself while I'm working, seeing how I'm operating, and accepting all of those things. So all of those things are a part of me. If I get angry, the challenge is to accept that anger and try not to operate that as much as I can going forward. If I am selfish or I find myself being manipulative or something like that, it's like, can I accept all these dark parts of me that are my shadow self? So self-acceptance is an important part. Present moment awareness is the third thing that I found really important, and that's traditionally been a part of Buddhism, since the Buddha, like mindfulness, meditation, being aware of the present, and not so locked up in thoughts. So can I be aware of my body, aware of my feet on the ground, aware of my breath going in and out, aware of you, aware of the sounds, and still having thoughts and being able to think, but not just being locked in my mind, because that can turn us into zombies and separate us from the world quite strongly. So present moment awareness. And then the fourth thing for me which has been the most important thing actually, is a practice of openness. So the practice of openness is basically dropping any defenses or closures that I have as best that I can, so that I can stay present and available and aware and with you. So, like, for example, if you were to insult me, I might notice a defense come up against that and be like, oh, he doesn't know me. Like, why is David insulting me? And you know, I'm okay and fuck him and all this kind of stuff, right? So this defense mechanism kind of kicks into place. And openness is about having the awareness to recognize that, have detachment from that, and try and let that go as quickly as possible to come back to a calm, equanimous, even state. And that's, man, openness in itself as a practice. If you're actually trying to remain open in daily life, you'll notice that you actually close like hundreds and hundreds of times every day with little interactions that you disagree with or that don't quite go your way, or you know, a client's upset with something I've done in my business, and it's like I close up and, you know, like react to that. So yeah, openness has been really cool for like unraveling all of the mechanisms of who I am as a person, and kind of delving into that and transforming, self-transformation.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I think that kind of relates to the experiential aspect of it, is when you can start to actually notice those things occurring, noticing the closings or the lack of focus or attention and how often that's occurring. To me, that seems like a critical element of it. People like, you know, you can see for yourself how much you're doing. Like, you can be conscious of that. Like, it's something you can do. To me, I think that is a really powerful aspect of that type of approach. Trying to think, another interesting thing that you brought up, that because I had mentioned before the show that I had just done a circling session for the first time, which I found fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. Even like just to appreciate the fact that 2 or 3 years ago, I would never in a million years have considered doing something like that at all. Like, if the idea come up, like, no, why would that? But then, you know, how much I was like, yeah, I'm like really looking forward to this. So that was nice. But I thought where it really got interesting for me, because I was the one circled as the first time there, and we were kind of going back and forth where the group was trying to, you know, evaluate what they were sensing from me. And then I kind of started to talk and give my story, and the facilitator had checked in with everybody, like, what's your impression of like what's going on so far, like how he is. And a couple people had said, you know, things like, oh, I get a sense of openness, or it's peaceful, or whatever. And I was like, okay. And then the third person was like, actually, I'm getting an extremely dissonant experience here. I feel like I am wanting to pull away in order to preserve like my self-identity. And I was like, you know, and then I felt the defense mechanism come up as just like, who the hell are you? You know, what, I'm sharing my soul here and you're ripping into me. But then I was like, okay, I was like, what is that sense of self that you're like, how are you perceiving that, and why is it dissonant? And we got to the fact that it seemed that she was saying that she felt like she was being pulled out of her body, like her sense of like somatic energy. And that's what she identified her sense of self most with, was a physical presence. And for me, I realized that I have essentially the exact opposite, like basic operating position, whereas I feel like I'm almost entirely in my head, and then the physical is an afterthought that I often tune out if I'm thinking about something. And so that was really fascinating to hear that. I thought it was the most fruitful part of the discussion to notice that, and it explains conflicts I've had, but it also really made me curious about the somatic side of it, because that is pretty much something that I've completely disregarded. But I can see the power and the way that it must fit into this. So when you talked about somatic practices, has that been something that, I mean, how has that been getting into that? Was it something, again, that you had thought about before, or was it kind of a strange, because to me, I feel like it's kind of an uncomfortable thing for me to really think about.
Yes.
and like be engaged in, but I can see the importance in how it must fit in. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, man. So yeah, when you were saying I mostly live in my head and the body has been something that I've kind of not placed importance on and pushed away if I'm thinking about something, that's been totally my experience as well. So, and I have people around me that are like the woman that you described, that are much more grounded in the body and live from their body and their emotional center as opposed to their cognitive thinking center. So yeah, for me, that's been a journey of integration, and I'm still not there. I feel like I'm scratching the surface on my somatic kind of integration 6 years in. I've been doing this for 6 years,
Yeah.
and like practices of yoga and Tai Chi and Qi Kung and various different practices that ground you in the body. Even going for a bushwalk in nature for an hour or two can be really, really grounding for me. Going for a swim at the beach, in the ocean, or in any kind of water can be very grounding. I take cold showers every day now. That's been really helpful for waking up the body and kind of keeping the awareness in the body, because that initial hit of cold water is very shocking. And it will like shock you and get that alive. And my meditation practice is like, some days it feels like a war going on inside of me, where I try and sit for long periods, and I'm trying to maintain awareness of the breath, and thoughts will come in quite strongly depending on how I've been in the world the last day or so, and what's been happening for me, how disturbed I might be. If things have been going badly or something, I'll notice thoughts coming up really, really rapidly. If my day's been relatively peaceful the day before and I had my morning sit, my mind will be relatively calm, which is a nice experience. And then things will kind of like, settle and relax from there. But that's been really useful in me being able to clear my mind to some degree, and be able to have that as kind of a benchmark of what a clear mind feels like, and then try and revisit that place and touch into that place as many times as I can throughout the day, even if it's just pausing and taking one mindful breath or 3 mindful breaths, just to bring me back to like center. But man, I've found it really difficult trying to integrate the body and trying to bring more of that somatic experience online. So really difficult, but also really fascinating, because it's such uncharted territory for me that it's like, man, this is rich, and there's like so much stuff happening. It's cool. Yeah.
Right. It was exciting to come across that and have that pop up. I was like, yeah, wow, that is a really strong resistance in me when that idea comes up. I was like, what? I think it comes from probably, and this is where I wish that there were, the school I attended in a lot more schools would try to integrate Eastern and Western thought a lot more. Because I think in my own mind, I think personality wise, I am that way already, but I think the internalized sense of duality that you get from Western philosophy and Christianity and Western based religion, where what you pick up is more or less that the body is the vehicle to get your soul through, and you got to take care of it enough that it can do the job, but a sense of like being in touch with the body and being aware of how it actually integrates with everything else that you're creating, I don't think really gets emphasized really at all, that I could remember encountering. Most of the time it's just like, just you can kind of dismiss the body. What matters is what's happening in your intellect and your soul.
Which is why I appreciate, John Vervaeke, why I respect him so much is because he is a Tai Chi teacher, he is a meditation teacher, and he's trying to bring the body back into spirituality. And it's why I appreciate Guy Sengstock so much, and his 20 years of experience with circling. And the feeling you get from Guy is he's such an empathetic, attuned human being. Like, if Guy's really listening to you, you feel like you've been seen and heard and understood for the first time. Like, it's he has such an amazing presence, and those aspects of those two guys are so valuable, so important, and so missing. Like, I agree with you totally that traditional Western philosophy and Christianity and the way we've kind of approached things in the West has denied and placed very little importance on the body. And I think to find a holistic integration, we need to bring the body back in. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I think I think there's something really interesting about the idea of embodying spirituality that I think comes up a lot at Vervaeke, that I think is fascinating. That I guess when you hear that phrase, embodying spirituality, and what is that like? What does that say to you? Like, what is your interpretation of that? Because I've been trying to wrap my mind around that in relation to this issue, and I'm not really sure what that means to me. So I'm curious to see how that lands with you.
The thing that comes up for me is spirituality. My teacher will say that spirituality is interchangeable with reality, right? So if I look at it from that perspective, embodying spirituality is like embodying reality. So for me, what that means is walking through the world completely aware, completely present, and completely open to whatever experience is happening in the moment. So it's being able to have intimacy with everyone I meet and try and lift them in some way, or bring them some joy, or bring them some love or happiness or care or something into their life that might give them a nice experience. It's so practicing that openness, staying present and aware of defenses if they might come up, and kind of letting them go so that I can be more in reality and not necessarily in my head. So yeah, the thinking mind is imagination in a sense. Like anything that we're thinking about is not happening in the world, it's happening in our mind only. And it's imagination, in that it's not actually real. It's kind of, we use it as human beings to come up with abstract concepts. So we might be able to figure something out in our mind that we can then enact in the world. But in that process of thinking, none of that is actually going on. So it's not real, or it's less real than my body, my breath, and what else is happening in the world. So it's being more in tune with embodying spirituality. To me, is the same as embodying reality, and it's having more of my awareness on what's real and less of my awareness on what's not real or false.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I heard from Ken Wilber one time, where I forget what he was answering. What he was trying to describe, basically what was guaranteed by the pursuit of a spiritual path, of trying to grow in wisdom and trying to grow in compassion. He saw those two as kind of the essential poles of it: wisdom and compassion. You have to grow up and you have to wake up at the same time. And I find that as a bedrock division. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a good way to look at it. It's very useful. And he had this phrase where he said, basically, what will come of this is it will hurt more and bother you less.
Yep.
And by opening yourself up to embodying spirituality and opening yourself in compassion, you're going to experience more of the hurt that is out there. Like,
yes,
it kind of occurs to me the same way that you notice those little closings or those little defense mechanisms as they pop up. You're going to notice the fact that it's there more.
yes.
So it's going to hurt more. But because of pursuing the path of waking up and seeing how it all fits together and it all does make sense, it bothers you less at the same time. And those are kind of the twin goals there. What have you heard that before? What does that say to you?
Yeah, totally. So that lines up with my experience too over the last 6 years. So my experience, what it used to be is like, something would bother me. Let's say someone insulted me. It wouldn't hurt very much because my defenses were so strong, but it would bother me for a long time. I would think and ruminate and hold on to it and be like, why is this person thinking this about me? And how can I change myself so that doesn't happen again? And like, avoid that situation or whatever. And as I've practiced openness over time, I've noticed that the initial hit I use the same example. Someone insulting me is like, oh, that hurt, like, ow. That there's pain there, and there's it's not a nice experience, and it's much more painful than how I would have experienced it years ago. But it doesn't bother me anywhere near as much, because mainly where I go now is their opinion of me doesn't really have any impact on me. Like, that's just their understanding of me through whatever filters or perceptions or belief systems that they're carrying. And it actually says more about them than it does about me and what they value in the world. So I don't really need to take that into myself. It's okay. And more self-acceptance of me, how I am. So they might be pointing out something that I know about myself, that I have a tendency to be selfish, or I'm too focused on business, for example, and less focused on people, let's say. And I go, yeah, that's true. And I can accept that. And so it doesn't bother me. I don't need to ruminate about it. It's kind of like, it's done. Once that happens, it's done. So yeah, and I've never heard that before. Ken Wilber's thing of it'll hurt more but bother you less. But to me, that's totally true. It resonates with me and my experience.
Yeah, that's probably, I would say, in my recent readings and listenings in the last couple of years, that's probably the thing out of all of it that has stuck in my mind the most, is just being such a helpful maxim. And it just makes perfect sense. It seems like ultimately, like, that's how it fits together in a broad sense. And that's why I think I mentioned, I like guys who are good at the synthesis of that. You can see, but it still has that interplay that you can't really have one without the other. And I think a lot of what is problematic in interactions and in human life is an excess of one of those without the other, or being grown up in a certain area but very immature and deficient in another area that you aren't aware of. Yeah. Another interesting thing that I'm curious about is when encircling the phrase being with and being here and being with somebody came up a lot. And that seems to be the bedrock of the practice, is being with in a radical way. And I'm curious what your interpretation of that is. Like, what does it mean to be here with someone, or to be, when people say to be with a feeling, like, what does that mean to you at this point?
Well, so I would interpret being with as there's no separation between me and what I'm with. So if I'm with a feeling of sadness, then I'm just fully present with the sadness. I'm not pushing it away in any way. I'm not trying to change it or wanting it to end. It's just there, and I'm with the sadness in me. And if I'm with you, I'm just tuned into you. I'm aware of what's going on for you. I'm present to you and how you might be reacting to what I'm saying right now. And there's less separation between you and I. There's a sense of intimacy between us. And there's some things that are necessary to be with, which is mainly getting rid of as many filters as I can inside myself to remain available to that being with. And it's similar to what Martin Buber describes as I thou, I would say. That I thou is quintessential being with, as opposed to the I it being an object to manipulate or control.
Yeah, I recently, I had heard of the I thou division, years ago, and off and on. I've heard about that, and I just recently had been reading more about it and thinking about that more, and it coincided to me with the idea that I feel like I absorbed in a Christian context of having reverence. And that's a more universal ideal, but that's where I picked it up, is the respecting of other beings' right to unfold itself as it needs to, and that everything has its own path that is actually going on. And that even you have reverence for certain sacred objects, but the reason you have reverence is because you understand that the most sacred things are those that are most beyond your ability to comprehend how they need to unfold,
Mm,
or how they're influencing the way things unfold. And that the idea of reverence, even the idea of reverence for another person, just respecting that they have, that you can't treat a person as an it, and what it means to be a person is that right to unfold to some
yes,
extent.
yes.
And I've had numerous experiences where I've noticed this clash before and couldn't put really a label on it, but it affected me deeply. And like, for example, I was in I had done the Camino in Spain. Have you heard of that? There's a like a pilgrimage hike across Spain. I did that in 2015, and my friend and I went to Rome afterwards just to kind of recuperate. And we visited St. Peter's Basilica. Obviously, we went to see the Sistine Chapel and the Pietà and all the the great Michelangelo works that were there. But I remember being the whole thing essentially being ruined by the fact that I felt like it was such an irreverent way to experience the artwork that it almost just made the whole thing worse. Like I kind of wish that I hadn't gone there because
Mm,
when you're standing in front of the Pietà, you're looking up at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and it's just bedlam around you. People are talking, taking pictures, and taking pictures themselves in front
mm,
of it,
mm.
and it just seemed like there's just no acknowledgement of the fact that this is something that is so beautiful that it has its own it it has its own demands on your attention, that you have
Yes,
to approach it in a
yeah.
certain way. And to me, I think, and I'd be curious to see what you think about this, but to me, it seems like that is similar to what I get from the sense of I and thou, that it's not just about people, but also about things in the world itself as being something that needs to keep unfolding, and that is the sense in which it's a thou. What do
Yeah.
you think about that juxtaposition?
Yeah, yeah, that lands with me as true. I mean, the unfolding. I like the word unfolding that you're using there because, um, yeah, there is a sense in which beings, to me anyway, beings are unfolding and developing and growing, and that to me is part of what I value most about my life and my journey is this unfolding that I'm going through. And to value the unfolding in someone else, yeah, there is that it invokes that experience of reverence and experience of respect and care and like allowing the unfolding to take place as it wishes to, instead of imposing my will on the unfolding. Like, no, you have to be a certain way for me because I'm uncomfortable unless you're a certain way. And
Right.
you acting outside of the parameters which I've set on you as my wife or my friend or my teacher or my anything, like my colleague at work, that's not okay for me because that makes me feel insecure or like I can't control you or like, whatever it is, whatever the experience is, it's the opposite of that, just allowing and that acceptance of everyone's on their own journey. And it's beautiful to just let that journey kind of take its own path and just to observe it. So yeah, I think you're on the money there.
Yeah, I think it's powerful as well to think of the fact that when you think about the way that you become, as a sort of participatory knowing, the way that you become when you are treated like an it as an opposed to a thou
Mm, mm,
by a person, it's interesting to transfer that to the way that you treat the world, both as you experience it and in its physical sense,
mm,
as an object as well. Like the
mm.
way that you can see that it damages you when that happens, that must be occurring in the same way in the world if you treat it as an object as well. And I think
Yes.
there's a lot of ways that you can see degradation that occurs in that way.
Yeah.
And I think I just find it, and maybe this will be kind of a good closing section to visit. But I recently came across in one of the videos. I think it was Jordan Hall was in it. And I think Vervaeke, and they were discussing the feeling that the world is, or no, it was with Guy, discussing feeling that the world is personified
Mhm.
at the bottom of things, and they were discussing liminal states when you're right on the verge of falling asleep, and awareness is completely retreating and retracting, and they were commenting that it's often at its basis before it completely transitions, there's just this general sense of presence, of somebody
Mm,
that's there.
mm,
And they were talking, I found this fascinating, is that kind of being the basis of what all religion is built on, and ultimately what all spiritual practices leading up to is that experience of just the utter thou-ness of the world, just there at its most basic sense,
mm,
either through our own interpretation or some combination of the way it is and the way that we interpret reality. We need there to be a personification to the world. We have to relate to it,
mm.
and that's like the most basic sense in which, or the most basic way in which we connect with the world, at a simple level. I'm curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, the personification of the world, I'm not so sure about. I think it's possible to have an I-thou relation with anything, any object. Like you can have an I-thou relationship with a tree. Um, um, so the way I approach it, or the way my teacher approaches it, is that the world is essentially emptiness, like beingness, right? And it comes into form through consciousness, but at the core of everything is emptiness, and energy kind of flows around that emptiness and appears as physical reality, but really it's all energy with emptiness under that energy. So you go to the center of the atom, and scientists are getting deeper and deeper into what's at the core of the atom. It used to be just protons, neutrons, and electrons. Now we get down into quarks, and then we get into subatomic particles. But at the core of everything, the best idea we have as humanity currently is string theory. So it's like it's either strings that are vibrating in a certain vibratory frequency, or it's particles that have a certain energy makeup to them. But I'm not professing to understand string theory, right? But the basic idea is that at the base of it is nothing, is empty space, and then energy is the most fundamental thing that's imposed on top of that. And my teacher would say that love is also, in a way, fundamental to the universe, in a similar way to the way beingness or emptiness is fundamental, in that we can experience love of anyone and anything if we're open. So if those defenses are down and we're present and available, love will be experienced and love will flow. So that's kind of the way I intellectually understand it anyway. I'm not saying that this is my experience. This is just kind of things that I've picked up, and the way that it makes sense to me. And I haven't experienced anything that like contradicts that.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the way that that's framed, because I can have deep periods of meditation where I experience myself as basically nothing, because my mind shuts up and I kind of disappear and melt as a person, and there's just space. All I experience is awareness with space. And there's also times when I feel my heart completely open up, and I just want to hug everyone I see, and I want to be like, you're amazing, you're such a beautiful being. And so the emptiness and the love dancing, to me, that's like, yeah, man, that's cool. I can get on board with that.
Emptiness and love dancing. Yes, I love that. I think it's interesting for me to wrestle with that idea that comes up in Buddhism of emptiness being the core of everything, because I think that's again something that really clashes with the Western mindset. Like nothing's the evil thing; it's what you have to get rid of. That's always it's always a villain. Like, did you ever see the movie The Never-Ending Story when you're growing up?
No.
This is like this kid's fantasy thing, but it was like an existential movie where it was like the nothingness was just absorbing the world, and the mission was they had to go do something that would get rid of it, and then it would,
Yeah.
So there's like, I feel like there's such like this horror of like nothingness as being like essentially evil, and that's what you eventually have to get rid of. So it's so difficult for me to wrestle with that, of being like that emptiness. But I think there's a sense in which it's not it's emptiness and that just isn't void somehow.
Yeah.
It's just possibility.
Well, so I don't think of it as like emptiness being a bad thing. I see it as emptiness being a good thing because it embodies possibility. Like anything is possible if emptiness is at the base. And it also speaks to a humility. Like the ego allows things to happen. It doesn't get bigger, better, and more powerful and control and manipulate the world. The ego kind of lets things unfold as they will, like you were talking about the unfolding. So the emptiness kind of, it does challenge the ego, like you were saying. You feel the challenge in that. But I feel like forget the institution of the church and how the church has kind of put forth the Bible. If you just look at Jesus's words, he would say things like, you must be like a child to enter my kingdom of heaven. And it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And he would say, love thy neighbor as thyself, and love thy enemy as well. Like, so he was in a way, and he'd also, I think in the Old Testament, there's a phrase that says, be still and know that I am God. So there's these, like, to me, if you look at it through a certain lens, and I think truth is truth, regardless of what religion you're coming at it from. There are Christian mystics, there are Jewish mystics. Like this guy, I don't know if you've seen any videos from Zevi Slevin.
I've seen that name, but I haven't heard him.
Okay,
He's
he's
on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, John's had a couple of conversations with Zevi, who's a Jewish mystic, and I think there's the similar concepts in Jewish mysticism, and I think in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, in Sufism, in all of these religions, there's one fundamental truth, and it's just there's different ways of describing it. And Jesus, was very much a heart teacher and focused on love and being a good, loving Christian. And I don't think that in any way clashes with the fundamental teachings of Buddhism. And I think that some of what he said actually pointed to the emptiness. And if you interpret the kingdom of heaven as this, blissful, joyous state here on earth, not as some other place that you go to after you die, you can enter the kingdom of heaven by allowing the emptiness in, as far as I'm concerned. So, it is confronting to think that at the core of me, I'm empty, or I don't really exist, or there's something like at threat if I really embrace this emptiness, because then who am I? Like, who is this person, Maitreya, if actually at the bottom of everything is emptiness? But I also think that in that is endless possibility and endless unfolding.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to even just the connotations we have with words. I think people use emptiness, and it's always used in a dark way, like my life is very empty right now. My cupboards are empty. I don't have any food. There's always this, like, it has this sense of lack implied to it. And I think it's hard to think psychologically of the principle of the world being a lack of something, but I think maybe when you think of it as it's just possibility, it makes more sense, because the more that I wrestle with it, the more that I see that it really is there, everything. If there isn't that emptiness, nothing can change. And if nothing can change, nothing would last. Everything would block up and be destroyed quickly. It makes sense that it's there. But it reminds me of something that I really like about John's series, about how he's always focusing on thinking about the word that you're using and where it comes from, and what just the emotional impact of hearing that word is. I think that would be something that I've tried to pay more attention to, and I think would really serve just kind of the general discourse well, to think about what words and what the attachments are to the words. Another thing where you're like noticing the way that it's happening. But it's fascinating. It's just fascinating to think of emptiness being the principle. But I think if you think again in like in terms of an I-thou relationship, there ultimately is something that's tying it together.
Yes.
Being an empty,
yeah.
Really fascinating. Cool. Well, I think that might be a good place to stop here. But I really appreciate the chat. I got a lot out of that. I think there's a lot that's been percolating as I've been thinking about these questions, and I'm glad I've started to call into the show a little bit. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think yeah, I think no, I think that was very helpful for me. Yeah.
Yeah, me too, David. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and yeah, likewise, I got a lot out of it too. And I just like talking to people that are interested in this stuff and have an enthusiasm and an energy for it, and you clearly do. So yeah, to me, this is like the most alive experience to just chat about what is life and what are we doing here. Like it's really
Yeah,
cool. It's
I
a
know.
fun experience for me.
I feel like the opportunities are few and far between a lot of times.
Yeah, yeah,
um, when they come, they're precious for sure.
yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, it was great talking, and I, wish you the best in your pursuits. Maybe we'll check in somewhere down the road and
Yeah, that'd be nice.
see how it's
Absolutely. I'd
going.
love to. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Cool,
sounds good,
man.
man. All
Take
right.
care, my friend.
Yeah, take care.